Okay, so hopefully audio is okay on this new microphone. If not, let me know feedback. But I wanted to run through kind of like the last video in this NHL model series, just because everything got done a lot quicker than I expected. I think I thought that being the NHL, the league would be a lot sharper and more difficult to beat, which it definitely is. The ROIs are way lower than the other hockey leagues that we do. But I think what makes it easier is because there's more liquidity, the odds are pretty close together. So there's just less VIG or less juice, whatever you want to call it. Meaning instead of having, say, decimal odds of 1.85 or even 1.82 on either side of a money line, the NHL is 1.95 on both sides, if not better, if you shop around, especially when you use closing pinnacle lines. And if you also have a Chris or Bookmaker or Circa, or you can use the exchanges or whatever, you can get down to pretty much zero VIG or zero theoretical hold, depending on the actual game you want to bet in most cases. Now, this was pretty long. You can see all these scripts in here and JSON data and formatted with different things. I'm going to just run through how I did this. Like I said in the last video, I'm not going to go into detail of each script because if we end up using this properly in the future, it's not worth the risk to have this basically out there public. But you can see the kind of core ideas. In the last video, I touched on how we cleaned up the data and then we added the odds. You can go back and watch that idea. But here's what we did in the last one. So data extraction, I've covered all this already, but you can have a little read through here if you're just going to watch this one video. Essentially what you need to do is you need to use the NHL API. I just use Claude to help me use that. If you throw in the documentation and say, hey, build this so it outputs XYZ, it does that in one script. It's very, very easy. Then we cleaned all the data. We converted this into the formats that we need for both seasons. So I decided to run this for the 2024 and 2025 season. 23, 24 and 24, 25 season. If you can hear something in the background, it's just the laptop taking off. Don't worry about it. The next thing we did was basically convert this into the script that we use on how we approach things. So this is slightly different to how other people do any sort of moneyline sport betting. But for hockey, we just like to look at individual shots and kind of make adjustments off the back of each shot. So if you think about like a really, really simple model, like a really dumb one would be, okay, a team goal differential, right? Through the course of the last XYZ games, last 10 games, last 20 games, whatever. And you could say, okay, team X has a plus 15 goal differential in their last 10 games. Team Y has a -3. And then as a result, you can say that team 1 is expected to win by, and then you could run some sort of probability calculation where you take raw ratings into probabilities. So if they have a 18 goal differential in their last X number of games, that you can then convert into a money line probability. You can relate that back to the odds of the market. Now, that's obviously a really dumb idea just because it's just not going to work. It's not going to be profitable. But if you could then go a level deeper, we can go into a second example, which would be something like raw shots back in the day, 12, 15 years ago, probably worked, right? Then you go into raw shots with adjustments. So this is where the whole Corsi concepts came in. And then you could go into, okay, what happened on each shot? Where was it taken in the rink? So then you go into like locational Corsi or locational expected goals. Then you can go into who took that shot. Are they above average shooter? Are they elite shooter? Who else was on the ice? And then you can go into things like that. And then you can go into, okay, game state. So you can go into home, away, and then score adjusted Corsi is one of the things that's quite common. I'll get into a website I like in a second. But all of these ideas, you can just level on top of each other. So what I like to do is start with like a really, really simple concept and then just try and make it more accurate. Not even worry too much about like predictions or betting, just try and make it more accurate to common sense, right? That's what we do in cricket. That's what we do in all the sort of like money line related sports, is start with a really cool, obvious idea. you have X team of players. Everybody knows these players are better. Say it's a really one-sided game, and try and quantify by how much, and then go from there and just add levels of complexity to it. So just running back through this after my little ramble. So check all matches are correct, and then manually go through and add the missing odds. This was pretty key, because if you don't do that, what's going to happen is basically you can have games where you think all the odds are in place, but they're actually not. And as a result, if you leave some like placeholder odds, it can skew models massively, just because most of the teams you're going to bet, if you have a simple model, are going to be favorites. So if you have placeholder odds of, I just use 1.91 both sides, it's going to skew things quite a bit. Obviously, then manually verify things. I like to verify about 1% of games. In reality, it's probably like 0.2%, but it takes a long time. It's just important to do it that way. And then make sure we had a few bugs, so just went through and fixed those. Part 2 was basically taking the simplified version of an original structure that we used, reviewing the converted JSON data, and rebuild the logic of shot coordinates. So this is what we talked about in the last video, the end of the last video. And then run Corsi. And at this point, I wanted them to basically be close to something called Evolve Hockey, which is down here. And that I'm not going to talk about too much, but that website is awesome for stats. I'll just show you now, evolvehockey.com. This website is great for anything like XG or XGAR, goals above replacement, that stands for it. If you want to build like an individual player-based model, this is really good data, because it's all based on, I think, the publicly available NHL data, but then they've structured it in such a nice, clean way that you have all of the game info, you have everything you need. They even have like goalie ratings, they have skater charts, all of this sort of thing. And this is the live one, I believe. And it's just like a really clean way of seeing things. So if you have a look here, home win probability, obviously these are dots are goals. And this is on a time matrix, so time decay there as well. But yeah, this website is awesome. I think it's like $10 a month or something crazy, but this is something I use quite a lot. And even if you're just looking to build, you could definitely build a really accurate model off the back of this information and just put it together in a better way. So these guys are not betters at all. They have a podcast as well. I really like the Evolve Hockey guys, but you can tell by the way they speak, they're not like betters. They're just really like strong data scientists. But yeah, all of the tables and all of the logic around that is really, really good. So if you want to see like the top goalie for, let's just say, the playoffs, and let's say we want to sort it by expected goals against. So you got Bob, you got Otter, Stuart Skinner, etc. Expected saves against, yeah. So you can see that like it tracks, right? Like teams that did well, not so well, but teams that did pretty well, you can see, you know, usually aligned with like goalie performance as well. So yeah, just a really good website. I thought I'd shout them out. This was basically calibrating the model to see how close we get to break even. So when we first did all of this, we were maybe like -2% or something like that, -1%. So directionally pretty close. And after a few calibrations of obvious things, you can get to break even without going into like that much detail. Now, obviously break even is not good. But if you're betting a bigger sport, this is why I always say to start with like medium quality leagues, just because they're way easier to beat. And even though you'll have liquidity issues in the future, it's always nice to like do something and beat a sport than just being like, okay, I'm going to do the NFL and just never getting anywhere, or, you know, being naive and thinking you have something when in reality it's just variance. Like that's probably the biggest mistake I had in the past. And I just want to kind of remind people about that. So I'll just talk about the Evolve Hockey stuff. Now, I want to be a little bit careful with how I phrase this, because there is still an edge with some of their stuff, but they have something called game predictions, game percentage predictions. I don't think they were available on their site, so you have to collect them day by day. We did this for the past couple of seasons just because I had an inkling that they were directionally correct on some situations, which I don't think is giving too much away. But I wanted to backtest their performance versus closing lines, and one season they were up a few percent. The other season, last season, they were down a little bit. But there's certain situations where this point here, the model shows a bet on team. So this is our model we built, and the Evolve model shows 0% edge on team. So just like minus the VIG, they are onside. That would equate to a bet, and then backtest that, remembering that 0% for both models, yada, yada, yada. This is a concept called, I can't remember if it's Charlie Munger or something, but I've heard it in a couple of trading books as well. The core idea is it's better to have like multiple simple systems than one really overly complex one that you kind of overfit and you lose like logic for. So like this idea here is if we have a model that is decent, say like 2%, 3%, and we have another model, in this case I was hoping it was going to be the Evolve Hockey one, but obviously the fact I'm saying this shows that it wasn't. That's 2 or 3%. When those bets align, you have a consensus, right? So that's the same way that obviously on a bigger, better scale that like Billy Walters and a lot of these horse racing syndicates kind of work. They have multiple really good handicappers, and those handicappers, when they are say on a consensus or not against each other, that's usually a really strong signal to say, okay, that bet is a 10, 15, 12, whatever percent ROI bet that is going to do really well. And if you backtest that, you can see that that generally plays out. And that's why like this whole, I want to say like wisdom of handicappers, so kind of like wisdom of crowds, but obviously you have to also be sharp and do things in a different way, works even better. So if, say, for example, I was a, I don't even know what you'd call it nowadays, like pen and paper handicapper, and I just watched games and I looked for angles, and then you had a hardcore data analysis, Monte Carlo simulation, neural networky guy that was only data, doesn't know the name of any single player. If those two come on the same side, and if you can prove that it's not the same thing, so a lot of the time the modeler is just basically proving that the handicapper of the person watching the event is proving their edge, essentially. If you can get around that being the same thing, so if they're coming at the play from two separate angles, it's really, really strong. I haven't got anybody I trust enough to do that, but like there are syndicates that do that incredibly well, and obviously Billy Walters was pretty famous for that sort of style. Now that didn't work, but hopefully that'll give you some ideas of what can work. Part 3, now the dates you can ignore. I just managed to do this a lot faster than I thought I was going to. The get goalie and player starting lineups and create JSONs for these. This is basically because when we first got the NHL data from the API, this wasn't there. So again, this is just like why hacking together things, why there's so many scripts in here and so many like extra things that now we no longer need, and it's been simplified down to the season data, the goalie data, ratings, and then some things about adding in new teams and things like that. That's why that's done this way. Okay, so just when you build it first, that's obviously not how you're going to go ahead and process it in the future. So don't worry if you think it's going to take like an hour a day to add games. It won't. You can like smooth it out in the future and build like pre-game scripts and things like that. So the next one obviously was going to be pretty, massive based on what we were looking with the goalie data here. It would be interesting to see how much like this aligned to actual like finishing position of teams. So can have a look. Obviously everybody knows Hellebuck was having like an incredible season, and then you've got Vass again, Kemper, okay, interesting. And then you can see this. Teams that did well obviously are aligned to strong goalie performance. That's not news to anyone. How much that is weighted against the odds is something that I wanted to kind of tell. So Here was the idea of the upload the format of the goalie info is processed, plus make sure we only use starting goalie info, so not time on ice, but actual starting goalie. So a lot of the data you can get is who played the most on ice percentage. Obviously, if a goalie got pulled, that isn't who you would use. So if they got pulled before 10 minutes through the second period, that isn't who you would actually see on the starting lineup. So you just need to be careful of that. So I'm just reminding myself here to double check and make sure that logic is in place, because starting goalies might not always have the highest time on ice. Then create a goalie rating script that creates goalie ratings based on their prior performance, documentation for this, shots prior performance, rates recent performance, potentially last X number of games, adds in ideas from Evolve Hockey goalie rating concepts, which is here. So our format should end up pretty close to this. Now, we don't want to use their ratings just because would be clunky in the future, but as long as we can kind of turn this into an actual rating and then turn that into a probability, that's what we're kind of going for. Ensure that we have goalie performance split by date, so we can use that in terms of point in time. So yeah, just avoid data leakage again, always reminding myself about that, and incorrect stats. So for example, this is a common issue, is when you add something in, you basically add that goalie's performance in for that game, but obviously in a prediction model it wouldn't have been played yet, and then add this logic into main.py, test and validate this. So if you add in your goalie data and you adjust for that, you can kind of see if or how much goalies matter to NHL betting lines. Obviously it's between a tiny bit and a lot. You can do your own calibration, but once you have that, adjust the parameter, calibrate it in your model and say, okay, is it 1%? Is it 20%? You can go from there. Now, this one was an interesting one. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but imagine you have expected goals of somebody taking a shot from, let's just say, a medium danger situation, and you have no other information apart from like the player taking the shot, right? You don't know who the goalie is, anything else. It's pretty obvious that we can adjust based on who that is rather than any other key information. So this is the part I was on about in the first bit, where I'm saying, okay, you have your goals model, which sucks. You have shots, which sucks. You have shots plus, some Corsi elements. You have shots versus like XY coordinates on the map. You have shots against specific goalies. So you can do all this to calibrate like the probability of somebody scoring, or just the XG, which is an easier way to think about it. And then you can add all those up at the end of the game and have a kind of like, expected result or expected win percentage, which there's some good places that do, whether you ran bad or well based on things like that. So if your team lost 4-0, but you had, I don't want to say like 4 XG versus 1 XG, chances are if that game played out again, you'd probably win that bet. Stuff like that is important. I think that's really important, building a model to avoid overfitting as well. But that's above the scope for this. So create hybrid NHL prediction adjustments. So I hadn't done individual player shot adjustments just because for a lot of other stuff, it wasn't really necessary. But this was a cool thing to do. There was some pros and cons. I'm not going to talk too much about that because this video is already long enough. But yeah, you get the idea. And then pre-game and updating the season for basically 25-26 ahead. This is essentially just building out individual scripts that when a new game comes in, we don't have to go through and actually run through all of these like 10 processes that we did with like extracting goalies, appending goalies, adding in the odds, player ratings, etc. We can just do one thing or one or two scripts, goalie rating, season integrator, and then we're good to go. That's kind of like the idea. Then we run all this. So once a game finishes on the NHL, goes live on the API, we can just update that, run 2 scripts, and then it's done. It's added to the doc. So it'll take 5-10 minutes in the morning after the games. I'm UK, so pretty easy to do. So then by midday, everything is in place and ready for the next game. So obviously it's a bit of a grind when you have a lot of leagues to do like us, but if you can smooth that process down from, half an hour to 5-6 minutes is going to make a massive difference if you're betting 10 leagues, right? Especially if you're a small team or anything like that. So hopefully this was interesting. You can build your own little like checklist similar to this, based on NHL or any other league. I think we're probably going to look into some other options just to try and give you more like granular approach. But obviously, when similar to the AFL, when something is built and it looks pretty decent, we're not going to show exact scripts for obvious reasons. We don't sell picks or anything like that. It's just pure trying to build your own thing. Any questions, let me know through the site or through YouTube. And that's it for a bit. Might start a tennis build soon, maybe a challenger model, but I'll let you know in the future. Okay, cheers.